He kneads gunpowder into a rag until it's half liquid. He plants a percussion cap on his spur. He strikes it with his bowie knife. The rag erupts in flame in his own hand. And now, how about you? What would you burn to stay alive? And how far would you go when the cold hunts you? Tonight, we pull back the curtain on 7 frontier fire hacks born of desperation. We'll show you how raw materials, from black powder to burning glass, became the last line between warmth and death. My name is Sam, and this is Wild America. And now, let's start at the very beginning with nothing but 2 sticks. Number 1. Hand drill, wood-on-wood friction fire. Fire wasn't always struck from steel. You see, sometimes when the flint was lost or the tinder was soaked, a man had to go back further, way back, to wood on wood, to friction, to the old way, the hand drill. It's as simple as dirt, but hard as hell. The natives knew it long before the first trapper stumbled into these mountains. They'd spin a stick between their palms, grind it down into a notch on a flat piece of wood, and work until the dust glowed into a coal. Blow it right, and you've got flame. Lewis and Clark saw it done in the summer of 1805 up in Shoshone country. One of their men watched a tribesman work the drill. They called it curious. Maybe it was. These were men used to flint and steel, quick sparks, fast fire. But out here, things got lost. Tools broke. And sometimes a man had to remember what he'd seen, what he'd been shown in some quiet moment by hands that knew the land better than he ever would. But yeah, like I said, it wasn't easy. The right wood helped: yucca, cedar, willow for the spindle, something soft for the fireboard, cottonwood, sage, dry as bone. A practiced man could do it in half a minute. But a greenhorn? He might rub himself raw before he ever saw smoke. You had to keep working the spindle hard. Your palms will burn and your arms ache badly. The wood would blacken first, then it would get powdered. Dark dust would then gather in the notch, and the heat would build up with every spin. You'd have to keep at it. You can't slow down. The second you eased up, the ember died before it was born. But once you keep at it, you'll eventually catch a smoke. A tiny hint of it, swirling up from below, but it's a tiny, tiny glow, faint as the first light of dawn. And that was your coal. Then you'd tip it gently into a nest of dry grass, shredded bark, or whatever would catch. Then you'd cup it in your hands like a dying man holding his very last match. Then you'd breath life into it, slowly, progressively. Breath too hard, and you'd smother it. Breath too soft, and it'd fade. The natives made it look easy. Out in the dry southwest, where the yucca stalks were bone-white and ready, a man could spin fire fast. But up in the cold, damp mountains, that's a whole different story. You see, wet wood wouldn't bite. Tired hands couldn't keep the pace. A trapper with busted knuckles or a fever might as well be rubbing stones together for all the good it'd do him. But most frontiersmen stuck to flint and steel when they could. It was faster and cleaner. But if you've ever tried spinning a stick between your palms till your hands bleed, you know there's got to be a better method. Number 2, bow drill. Fire from friction, that's another old way, similar to the previous one we talked about. Enter the bow drill. Same principle. Wood grinding on wood. But this time, you've got a little help. A bow, strung tight, looping once around a spindle. The way it works is by sawing it back and forth. And that spindle whirls fast, biting into the fireboard beneath. No more blistered palms. Folks had been using this trick long before the mountain men came along. The Inuit up north, where the wind steals heat like a thief, they fashioned their sockets from bone, and then they spun the drill with sinew. Down south, other tribes knew it too. But for most, the previously mentioned hand drill was enough. And once again, it's faster to grab flint and steel if you had it. But if a man is lost without his kit, he'd remember the stories. Maybe he'd seen a native work the bow once, or read some old trapper's account. So he'd carve the pieces, a curved stick for the bow, and a cord to string it, a straight and dry spindle, a fireboard, notched just so, and something to press down on top like a stone, a chunk of antler, or anything to keep the spindle steady while it burned its way through. Then the work. Back and forth, slow at first, finding the rhythm. The bow's pull doing what your hands couldn't. And this time, blisters are spared, but your shoulders will ache and your arms will burn. But you had to keep at it until the dust piles, then blackens. Then there. A spark placed in the tinder. Frontiersmen knew it. The natives knew it. And if a mountain man had paged through some old survival manual, or just listened around the fire long enough, he'd know it too. The bow drill worked. Fast. Some say a practiced hand could pull an ember in 5 seconds. But out on the trail, with the right wood and a steady pace, a minute's work might be all it took. And once again, the bow drill was for when luck ran thin, when powder was soaked, when flint was lost, when the cold snuck up on you like death itself. Still, a man prepared was a man alive, and the pieces were easy enough to scrounge. Also, you won't find many journals bragging about it. Why write down what every woodsman knew? But the proof's there, in the old stories, in the artifacts left behind. The bow drill was part of the trade, a last resort maybe. But when the night got long and the fire wouldn't come, it was enough. And if you did manage to find flint and steel, then you'll save yourself a whole lot of effort. Number 3. Flint and steel striker. When matches were nowhere to be found, a mountain man turned to the next oldest trick in the book, flint and steel. Now, this wasn't some fancy invention, mind you. It was basic, simple, and passed down through centuries, used by Romans, Vikings, men who lived by the edge of a blade. And when Europeans crossed the Atlantic, they brought it with them. Men like Boone, Bridger, Lewis, and Clark. They all carried it. Because when the wind came down hard on you and the cold bit deep, this was the one thing that wouldn't fail them. Speaking of those old frontier legends, don't forget to watch their full episodes on our channel. We have hours-long series that will hook you from start to finish. But for now, let's show you how flint and steel worked. First, you strike a piece of high-carbon steel against flint, which is a sharp, hard stone. A spark flies every time you strike. It's not much, just a tiny glowing fleck of metal, burning white-hot for a second in the dark. But if it lands on the right tinder, like charred cloth maybe, or punk wood turned soft with rot, then it'll catch. You see just a hint of smoke at first, then a glow. Feed it gently and blow. And there it is. Fire. The smart ones carried their kit in a pouch which contained flint, steel striker, a little charred tinder, and maybe some dry grass or bark. Meriwether Lewis knew. Before heading west, he bought hundreds of flints and dozens of strikers. He knew his men would need them. He knew the land wouldn't forgive carelessness. But cloth was precious out there. So the old-timers learned to use what the earth gave them. Rotten wood, cattail fluff, tinder fungus, anything that'd catch that spark and hold it just long enough. A mountain man didn't wait for cold fingers and failing light to test his gear. Now this was faster than rubbing sticks and surer than prayer. Even greenhorns could learn it quick. And the natives, they took to it fast once trade brought iron into their hands, leaving their old friction fires behind. Why waste sweat when steel could call fire from stone? But nothing's perfect. Rain could ruin it, a dull flint, a worn-out striker. And if that happened, then suddenly you're blowing on dead sparks while the cold sets in. Smart men kept their tinder dry, their kit close. And once they had fire, they nursed it. At night, they'd bury coals in ash, a quiet promise for morning. But if wood friction fails, then you can always borrow fire from the sun. Number 4, burning glass. Sunlight. That's all it took. No striking, no rubbing. All you needed was a clear sky and a steady hand. A convex lens, no bigger than a watch face, could pull the fire right down from the heavens. Hold it just so, let the light bleed into a single, burning point. Dry tinder, charcloth maybe, or a scrap of punk wood, would smolder quick, just like the flint and steel method we talked about earlier. Then you'll get a wisp of smoke, and then the glow of an ember. It wasn't new, however. Men had done this for centuries. Ancient Greece's Archimedes himself was said to have torched enemy ships with mirrors. But out in the American wilderness, under the endless spread of western sky, a mountain man with a burning glass had an edge. There was no wasting tinder on failed sparks, no worn-out hands from spinning a bow drill. All you needed was patience and the sun doing the work. And of course, it had its limits. Cloud cover, or the low slant of morning or evening light, and that lens was just a piece of glass. That's why flint and steel still rode in every pack. But when conditions were right, then damn, it's faster than striking a spark. Lewis and Clark knew its worth. They carried 100 of them, not just for fire, but for trade too. They handed one to a chief, then watched his eyes when the tinder caught. No words needed. A thing like that spoke plain. By the way, don't forget our short episode about the dangers the Lewis and Clark expedition faced. It's one heck of an episode you wouldn't want to miss. Anyhow, yeah, some mountain men carried burning glass, tucked in a pocket, maybe fitted into a compass. Traders stocked them too. Not every man trusted glass over steel, but when the sun hung high and the air was dry, then, yeah, it was fire, pulled straight from the sky. A plain scrap of paper, a chunk of dry fungus. If the sun was strong, that was all it took. They'd hold the glass steady and wait. The fire would come. It's like pulling flame from the sky. A burning glass was practical, in the right season. It didn't run out, didn't wear down, no gears, no powder. A man resting at noon might light his pipe with it. He could save the flint for storm days. Some used their spectacles instead. Simple, yet still effective. But of course it had limits. No sun, no fire. It was useless at night, worthless in the rain. And in deep winter, with the sun dragging low, it often failed. Even more, the lens could crack on rough travel. Drop it once, and that was that. Nobody relied on it, to be honest, not for life. But when it worked well. It was a piece of the old world used in a new one. Science and survival tied together. And next up, air, force, and a simple piston to spark fire. Number 5. Fire piston. They called it a fire piston. Some said fire syringe. It wasn't common. Wasn't from here. But a few of these odd things made it west. Maybe it was brought over by traders. Maybe passed from hand to hand like some strange magic. It didn't look like much, just a cylinder and a plunger. Wood, metal, horn. But when you slammed that plunger down hard and fast, the air inside got squeezed so tight and hot that the tinder at the end would catch heat from air. Inside the plunger's tip, you'd pack a bit of tinder like charcloth, fungus, or even some fine dry fiber. Then you push it down fast, real fast, and if you did it right, you'd see it, just a hint of red, a coal. Then you pull the plunger back, and there it was. Life, held on the end of a stick. The trick worked because of pressure, the same kind of pressure that would later run diesel engines. But the fire piston came first. It had been used in Southeast Asia for a long time before Europe ever caught wind of it. It was made from bamboo, passed through generations. By the early 1800s, Europeans started building their own. A few made their way to America, maybe to a fort, maybe to a rendezvous, maybe to a trapper with coin to spare or curiosity to burn. But it never spread far. After all, out here, men trusted flint and steel. It was cheap, reliable, and easy to fix. The fire piston, however, was different. It was delicate, rare. But for the few who had one, the mountain men who knew how to use it, it must have felt like sorcery. fire from air. Just imagine, a trader or trapper at a rendezvous, surrounded by fellow trappers and tribesmen. He pulls out a strange tube, presses down hard, and just like that, fire. No spark, no flint. With just a pop of heat and ember, people would have stared, maybe leaned in closer. Things like that caught eyes. So yeah, tricks like these weren't unheard of. Lewis and Clark carried phosphorus to make fire appear from water, just to impress. Same idea, different tools. But if a mountain man carried a fire piston, was it worth the trouble? In some ways, yes. It made an ember fast, faster than flint and steel. And in wet weather, as long as the tinder stayed dry, it worked. Didn't need a spark, didn't need flame. Pressure was all that was needed, but it came with its faults. It had to be built just right. If the seal loosened or wore down, it failed. It needed grease or water at the plunger to keep air tight. That could freeze in winter or dry up in heat. And like any tool, it could break or be lost. But you know, that window was short. Friction matches came along in the 1820s. Lucifers, they called them. These were easier and cheaper, worked right out of the box. The fire piston died out. It never became common, but for a brief time, it stood at the edge of old ways and new ideas. And when gadgets fail, you can always point the lock and call sparks. Number 6. Flintlock firearms as igniters. A mountain man with a flintlock rifle could also start a fire. When matches weren't around or never existed in the first place, the lock of a flint gun could be all you had. These old guns worked by slamming a piece of flint against steel. That strike lit powder and fired the shot. But it also threw sparks, and sparks meant fire. If a man had powder but no char cloth, or if his fire steel had gone dull, he still had the lock. First, he'd empty the pan, pack in a scrap of tinder, maybe a sliver of cloth, blackened and dry. Then he'd cock the hammer, pull the trigger, and let the flint crash down. Sparks flew, and if he was lucky, one caught. Then the cloth would glow. Then he'd lift it out slow, careful not to kill the ember. He'd then tuck it into a bundle of dry stuff like grass, bark, or lint and breathe it to life. The whole gun became a fire tool, just a big, violent flint and steel. There was another way, too. Some men loaded a pinch of powder into the barrel without a ball, just the powder, and then packed some dry fluff at the muzzle, a scrap of moss maybe, or maybe a feather. Then they'd fire it. The blast might light the tinder right there in front of the gun. Quick fire, but risky though. It was loud and wasteful. Desperate move, really. Most stuck with the lock, however. Safer, quieter. They got good at it. Some used it just to light a pipe, bit of tinder in the pan, pop the hammer, and touch the glowing ember to the bowl. That lock, the snapping jaws, the sharp edge of flint, was so tied to fire making that folks made tools out of it. In the 1800s, some homes had what they called tinder lighters. It was simply a flintlock lock fixed to a small box. You'd pull the trigger, it sparked into the tinder, and there you had it, a flame, like an old-world lighter. Same idea, just louder. For mountain men, carrying a gun meant you already had what you needed to make fire. No need for a separate striker or fancy tools. All you needed was some dry tinder. This method worked in rough weather too. Wind, snow, cold, it didn't matter much. The lock sparked hard and clean, better than striking by hand. More force, more control, but it came with one warning: make sure the gun's empty. No load in the barrel, no powder in the chamber, just the pan and the lock. Some went so far as to take the lock off the rifle completely, just to be safe. Others carried a spare. Once the tinder caught a spark, it was back to basics, nested in dry fluff, and blow slow until it burned. So, yeah, a gun cracked skulls if you were cornered, and it started fires when the night got cold. Later on, when flintlocks gave way to percussion caps, the method slipped away. But for a time, if you had a flintlock, you had fire. Even native tribes who got these guns from traders likely used them the same way. And speaking of percussion caps, when rifle sparks run dry, your powder and cap step in. Number 7. Gunpowder and percussion cap. Emergencies? By the mid-1800s, percussion cap rifles and revolvers rode into every frontier camp. When rain soaked your tinder and flint and steel lay buried in your kit, you needed another spark. This was a last-ditch move, a trick born of desperation. A famous account of this method comes from the legendary cattleman and former Texas Ranger Charles Goodnight, who described how a scout could start a fire with nothing but powder, a bit of cloth, and a percussion cap. Goodnight's story, recorded by historian J. Evetts Haley, gives a step-by-step of this frontier hack. As a last resort, the scout dampened a calico rag and worked it in a quantity of gunpowder held in his palm until the cloth was saturated with the half-melted powder. He then placed a percussion cap on one of the prongs of his metal spur, wrapped the powder-soaked rag around it, and busted a cap on the rag by hitting the cap with the back of his Bowie knife. The cap would pop. Tiny flames and burning grains of powder burrowed into the rag, and in a heartbeat, that rag flared to life. You'd lift it carefully and set it under a bundle of dry grass or twigs. And then finally, you'd coax that spark into a proper blaze. But why lean on this risky hack? Well, on a soaked prairie night, matches were useless and wood was damp. But powder, once clumped tight, could still burn hot. And percussion caps gave you a small explosion on demand. You paid for it in valuable shot and caps. You risked a flying ember or a smart sting from the blast. But when cold, wet, and low on options, fire at any cost was worth it. This trick, however, never made it into any how-to book. But around campfires, men shared it in whispers. One cowboy would spill a pinch of powder onto damp kindling. Then he'd spark it with flint or a percussion cap, using the powder to wake flame in wet wood. So yeah, survival turned firearm gear into fire tools. You didn't try this for every campfire, but when you knew what you were doing, it worked. A percussion cap spits a jet of flame. Black powder flashes in a heartbeat. Wrapped in cloth, it smolders, even when wet. That spark cut through the moisture, but it cost you bullets and caps. And out on the plains, ammo was as good as gold. You only used it when you had no choice. By the 1850s, matches were rolling off wagons. Still, rain could kill them. So imagine a ranger in a thunderstorm, everything soaked. He'd bite down on the memory of an old scout's tip, heel of his spur as anvil, a scrap of shirt dusted with powder. One strike, cap pops, rag glows, and he's got his fire back. Truly, these moments show how resourceful they were. They bent military tools to bushcraft needs. From rubbing sticks to chemical sparks, they tried it all. And in the end, fire was survival, forged from desperation. Every spark burned a story of risk and resolve.